Hello everybody and welcome back to a lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture we are going to look at the beginning of the Cold War. Um, uh, but before we begin our lecture proper, I'd just like to do a customary recap and just touch bases a little on what we discussed in our last lecture. So in our last lecture we looked at the ending of World War II. In our last lecture series, we actually went through the entirety of World War II, from the buildup of wartime animosities through the attack on Pearl Harbor, and of course the American campaigns in the Pacific theater, and of course the European theater, and the ending of the war. The Pacific theater, just a dogfight between the American forces and the Imperial Japanese forces, through the island hopping campaigns, that stiff resistance, the cataclysmic battles of the Midway, the Coral Sea, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest battle, naval battle in history, taking of Okinawa, the emergence of the kamikaze pilots, and of course the dropping of those two atomic bombs that between the 6th of August 1945 and the 9th of August 1945 brought the Japanese finally to heel. And the Japanese would make only one demand had they surrendered, and that would be that Emperor Hirohito retain his imperial title, his imperial dignity. And the European campaign marked by the very stiff resistance of the Soviet Union, as they fought the Nazis through the battles of Moscow and Stalingrad, Leningrad, eventually breaking and destroying German army group center, annihilating the German army in the east, racking up hundreds and thousands of casualties, and inflicting hundreds of thousands of casualties on the German army, while sustaining millions of casualties on their own, tens of millions of casualties on of their own. Finally pushing into Germany, and the war in Europe largely ending with the suicide of Adolf Hitler. About a week after Hitler's suicide, Admiral Donitz, his successor, surrendered, and the war in Europe came to an end. And we also began to see the global implications of this war. The burgeoning superpowers, the burgeoning new generation superpowers, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and fascist Italy had been, had largely been humbled and checked. Their countries, their economies lay in ruin. The French had been defeated soundly at the beginning of the war, and would no longer be able to hold on to the mantle of power. The British had fought on the winning side, but the victory had been far more costly for the British, and they would soon find that they would not be able to hold on to their grasp of power. And the United States and the Soviet Union would emerge as the only real true world powers, the only true titans, global titans, and it is to that we turn. So after World War II, the existence of atomic weapons of mass destruction became central to post-war geopolitical conditions. World War II ended without a formal peace treaty. There was no great sit-down with the major belligerents like there had been after World War I with the Versailles peace talks. The United States and the Soviet Union disagreed over the future of Eastern Europe. Social ideologies, and they quickly fell out after the war ended. Now, the United Kingdom and France had been severely weakened by the war. They were no longer in a position to maintain their global imperial policies. Harry Truman made the momentous decision not to demobilize American forces and take up a global supervisory position. A temporary line that delineated the Soviet and American spheres of influences became permanent. That line will become the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union's acquisition of nuclear weapons in 1945 created a global stalemate, as neither side could upset this new balance of global power. And and that would largely lead to the stockpiling of nuclear weapons, the new foreign defense strategy for both nations. Would really sort of shift had this uneasy peace set in with the threat of mutually assured destruction. That when I was younger, we learned is mad, mutually assured destruction. In the Republic, the presence of nuclear weapons created intense anxiety and emotional debate about their maintenance and their future creation. Now, looking at the post-war breakdown. Roosevelt and Truman both believed that the nations liberated from the Nazi regime should hold free elections to determine their political futures. Franklin Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, Winston Churchill, they met periodically during World War II, first at Tehran in 1943 and then Yalta in 1945. And then Potsdam just after the fighting in 1945 ended. They met to discuss war policies and the post-war settlement. It had come to be seen that Franklin Roosevelt was too trusting when it came to Joseph Stalin and too skeptical when it came to Winston Churchill. Churchill had the reputation of an imperialist and a reactionary, which was true. He was very unwilling to break up the United Kingdom's vast colonial holdings. Churchill had tried to goad Roosevelt into a preliminary meeting before Yalta to coordinate their post-war settlement demands, but before a meeting with Stalin. But Roosevelt had refused. The three leaders grew to distrust each other and tensions were wrought. Stalin in particular had designed to create a protective Soviet zone in Eastern Europe. His plans were benefited by the fact that his armies were already in place in Eastern Europe. With armies in place, he had potential political adversaries assassinated in Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania. Within a year of the cessation of hostilities, the wartime alliance broke down, and it was Churchill who, at a speech in Fulton, Missouri, coined the phrase "Iron Curtain." The Iron Curtain. Churchill had hopes that the United States would lead an anti-communist international group in the West, just as the United States had led the war effort. At least from the British point of view, the United States has led the war effort. Meanwhile, Eastern Germany, centered on the Prussian province of Brandenburg, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary all became Soviet satellite states. Yugoslavia, while communist, maintained semi-independence under Tito. The Soviets faced several revolts during their consolidation, such as the Czech Revolt of 1948 and in 1968, the Hungarian Revolt of 1956, which and all three of these, I should say, were brutally repressed and put down by the Soviets. The United States, due to the nuclear stalemate, was really powerless to intervene or offer any objections to the Soviet actions. The Soviets continued many Nazi repressive initiatives, such as converting Nazi concentration camps into Soviet concentration camps, which Stalin could now use to house and exterminate his enemies, just as Adolf Hitler had once did. Now, in the decade that followed the end of World War II, the Iron Curtain became a political and economic dividing line. The economies of the Soviet satellite states were slow to grow due to the lack of competition, it is said, and heavily centralized industries. All of their industries were heavily controlled by the state. Cynicism and resentment spread throughout the workforce, as did the destruction of the environment in Eastern Europe. In their effort to industrialize and to get on a productive footing, they wreaked havoc on their natural environment. A very marked difference between the two societies began to emerge. with capitalism becoming the embodiment of prosperity, buoyed by rock and roll or rhythm and blues music, movies, particularly Hollywood movies, and prosperity, great prosperity most of all, came to symbolize communism during this time, capitalism during this time, while communism became associated with deprivations, severe hardships, and of course economic stagnation. Now, after World War II, the global powers underwent a dramatic realignment. The United Kingdom, which, as we have seen throughout our course on American history, maintained a global presence since the late 1500s and had been a major colonial power since the 1600s. The United Kingdom was no longer in a position to maintain its status as a world power. Winston Churchill, as noted earlier, was an ardent imperialist, and he was voted out of power by the British public and replaced by Clement Attlee. The British public regarded Churchill as a war leader who was not suitable to lead the nation in peace times. Attlee was also committed to the idea that the sun has set on the British Empire. One of the old sayings about the British Empire was that it was an empire upon which the sun never set. And when you factor in time zones, that is true. They had these global possessions that stretched around the world, and at some point during the day, the sun would be shining on some portion of the old British Empire. And that Attlee had taken the idea that the sun had set. Churchill's ardent refusals to acknowledge that cost him his job. Attlee came in with the idea that it was time to let it go. Attlee's Labour government very quickly relinquished their holdings, their hold on the imperial holdings. First, the British Raj, which was partitioned into India and Pakistan. Pakistan will be divided. Each Pakistan would retain the name Pakistan, while West Pakistan retained the name Pakistan, and East Pakistan became Bangladesh. And the partition was largely rooted in religion. The Hindus retain India for the most part, although there is a very sizable Indian Muslim population, and the Muslim populations retained Pakistan. Pakistan did not exist before the partition. It was a self-created state, and Pakistan and Bangladesh are the successor states to first Pakistan, the Pakistan of the partition. The Palestine Mandate was also reorganized into a Jewish homeland after Kenya was rejected by Zionist Jews seeking to leave Europe after the Nazi deprivations. The war had weakened the United Kingdom to the point that it was no longer able to police the world like she had done during the 19th century. And it fell to Harry Truman to decide whether or not he was going to assume the role or withdraw from European affairs like the United States had done after World War I. His decision to remain in Europe was a revolution in American foreign policy. This was something that had never been undertaken before. This was an evolution in American political thought. The United Kingdom had been supporting anti-communist regimes in Greece and Turkey, which were then fighting against communist-backed guerrillas. In 1947, Truman indicated that he was willing to back the governments there to prevent the spread of communism. Truman went out of his way in a congressional address to outline his position in a speech that became a central part of the Truman Doctrine. And every president either had a plan or a set of ideas that become central to their administration. Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal. Theodore Roosevelt had the Square Deal. When you look at Truman, you think of the Truman Doctrine. And then this became a central part, the central part of Truman's presidency. So the governments in Greece and Turkey were less than ideal, though. They were not democratic and were proved and were proved and they were really proved to be the first in a string of governments that the United States would back solely due to their opposition to communism. An interesting aspect of the United States foreign policy arose due to this, and that would be how unscrupulous a regime or government can be while still receiving backing from the United States. And the backing from the United States will be solely based on the fear of what will replace it. That became sort of this very intriguing justification question for the United States, and one that largely still continues to the day, to this day. Now, George Kenning conceived the policy of containment, which would become central to the United States policy regarding the spread of communism. Kenning outlined this policy of containment in what became known as the Long Telegram. Kenning sent the Long Telegram while working as a diplomat in the United States Embassy in Moscow. Kenning later called for the United States to combat communism around the world, wherever it spread. This policy will prove to be central to the United States actions, and it largely led to the later Korean and Vietnamese War. Those two wars can be seen as directly linked from the policy of communism containment, because they were wars that were designed to contain or eliminate communism in those two respective countries. Now, the Marshall Plan called for American resources to be dedicated to the revitalization and buildup of Western Europe. Western Europe had been truly devastated by the rampaging armies, and Western Europe had been a lot of Western Europe had not really recovered from World War I. So really, you're looking at damage going back to 1914. The time now would be 1947, 1948. You're looking at 30 plus years, nearly 35 years of war damage, of social damage, and just social trauma that had not really been healed or addressed. And for the first time, the Marshall Plan came in with this global plan to heal, to revitalize, to one, inspire confidence, but to two, make sure there were funds available so that so that Western Europe could recover. Marshall proposed the Marshall Plan during the graduation ceremony at Harvard University. In his speech, Marshall, who was serving as the Secretary of State, called for the rapid rebuilding of the industrial capacity of Western Germany. This was not a purely selfless offer from the United States. It was seen as much better for the global community for the belligerents to be strengthened as quickly as possible rather than left weak halfway done after World War I. Germany was reconceived as one, an ally in a possible future struggle against the Soviet Union, and two, a strong democracy in this war against this ideological war against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union at this point had been reimagined as the United States' primary antagonist. The global lessons learned after the stock market crash and the crash of the Great Depression was that for continued health of the American economy, the United States' potential allies and rivals must all be strengthened. And with that, we shall break, and we shall come back with part 2 of this of our examination of the beginnings of the Cold War. As always, I am Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture.